Welcome to Life Stories, where every story carries a profound lesson. Today, we bring you a heartwarming tale about a young boy who, despite having so little, teaches us all the true meaning of honesty and kindness. Follow along as one man's life is changed forever by a simple act of integrity from a homeless child. This story will remind you that sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story and join us for more inspiring life tales. It was a chilly afternoon in the heart of the city, where the streets hummed with the rush of everyday life. People were walking, hurrying to finish their tasks, oblivious to one another in the whirlwind of their busy routines. The man, his name was David, walked briskly along the sidewalk, his mind lost in the conversation he was having on his phone. His voice, filled with frustration, carried faintly through the air as he spoke to a colleague about work-related matters. His posture was tense, shoulders slightly hunched from the weight of his own thoughts, his steps quick and mechanical. He didn't see the wallet slip out of his pocket as he reached for his phone with one hand. It fell to the ground, unnoticed by him, as his attention was entirely consumed by the conversation in his ear. The small leather wallet, now on the pavement, lay there quietly, waiting to be discovered by someone who might need it, or perhaps someone who could teach him a valuable lesson. And as fate would have it, it was a young boy who noticed the wallet first. The boy, perhaps no older than 10, was a regular sight around these parts. He wore worn-out clothes, his shoes barely holding together, and his face carried the weariness of someone who had known more hardship than any child should. His eyes, however, were sharp and observant, scanning the streets not just for food, but for something to hold on to, something that might offer him a glimmer of hope in an otherwise harsh world. His name, as he later told David, was Elijah. Elijah was walking along the same street, his small hands clutching a makeshift bag filled with whatever he could gather that day. The world seemed to pass him by, unnoticed, just as he had always been, an invisible figure among the crowd. But then, as his gaze wandered to the ground, something caught his eye, a wallet. It was an unusual sight in his world, where the most common discoveries were scraps of paper or empty bottles. A wallet, intact and full of promise, seemed almost too good to be true. He crouched down slowly, his eyes darting nervously to see if anyone would notice. But no one was around. Not even the man who had dropped it. He hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flickering in his young eyes. But then, curiosity won over, and he picked it up. As he opened the wallet, his breath caught in his throat. It was filled with cash, several bills, perhaps enough to change his life, or at least the course of his day. Elijah had never seen so much money in one place, and a temptation stirred within him. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the money, the weight of it suddenly too much to bear. He thought of what he could buy: food, new clothes, maybe even a warm meal for his mother, who was always struggling to make ends meet. But as quickly as the thought came, another voice, quieter and more resolute, reminded him of his upbringing. His mother had always taught him one thing above all else: never take anything that doesn't belong to you. The words echoed in his mind, not as a reprimand, but as a moral compass that had guided him through many tough situations. With a deep sigh, Elijah made a decision that would come to define him in a way he never anticipated. He turned and began to run toward the man who had unknowingly lost his wallet. David, still engrossed in his conversation on the phone, had no idea what was happening behind him. The boy, now running towards him, shouted out his name. "Sir, sir." Elijah's voice was urgent, breathless. As he reached the man's side, David turned, startled, and saw the boy holding out the wallet with both hands, a look of earnestness in his eyes. For a moment, he was confused. The boy didn't seem like someone who would be returning lost property. "I think you dropped this," Elijah said, his voice soft but firm, as though he had been carrying this responsibility for much longer than his years suggested. David, still distracted by the phone call, didn't initially grasp the significance of the moment. He simply took the wallet from Elijah without much thought, still talking into the phone. But then, something registered in his mind. He glanced at the wallet and realized that it was not only intact but filled with money, lots of it. His heart skipped a beat. David hung up the phone and looked down at the boy, a frown forming on his face. He hadn't noticed anything unusual about the boy at first, just another child from the streets. But now, with the wallet returned, he saw something different in Elijah's eyes. "Why did you return this?" David asked, genuinely puzzled. The temptation had been there. The money was enough to change anyone's day. Why hadn't the boy kept it? Elijah didn't hesitate. He looked David straight in the eye and replied with a quiet dignity. "My mother taught me never to take anything that isn't mine. She says it's not the right thing to do. Even if I'm hungry, even if I don't have much, I can't take what belongs to someone else." David felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard the words before, but never spoken with such conviction. He was taken aback by the boy's integrity, the wisdom in his young eyes. It was a stark contrast to the world David was used to, a world where people often took more than their fair share, where moral lines were blurred by convenience. But here was this young boy, a stranger in the city, showing him a lesson he hadn't even realized he needed. David was touched, deeply so, and in that moment, he felt a shift in his heart. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and extended them to the boy. "Here, take this. You've earned it. You're a good kid." But Elijah, shaking his head, stepped back. "No, thank you, sir," Elijah replied, his voice resolute. "I don't need it. I'm fine. My mom will be okay too. I just did what I was taught." David watched as Elijah turned and began to walk away, his small figure disappearing into the distance. A wave of emotions washed over him, admiration, confusion, and something deeper, something that made him pause and question his own choices in life. The boy's honesty had stirred something in him that he couldn't quite explain. David stood there for a few moments, still holding the wallet in his hands. The boy's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of how much he had taken for granted. The city buzzed around him, the noise of cars honking, people chattering, and the distant hum of life going on as usual. But for David, it all felt distant. He looked down at the wallet again, noticing the way the leather had aged with use, how it was worn from time but still held the value it contained. He had lived his life by a different set of rules, rules that made him more guarded, more cynical. But the boy's simple honesty had cracked through the walls he had built around himself. And David felt a pang of guilt for not realizing sooner how far he had drifted from the basic values of kindness and integrity. David decided, almost instinctively, to follow the boy. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps he wanted to understand more about the boy's world. Or maybe he felt a deep, unspoken connection to the purity of Elijah's actions. Whatever the reason, he found himself walking down the street, keeping a careful distance behind the boy, making sure not to catch his attention. He needed to see where the boy went, who he was, and what kind of life he led. The boy walked with purpose, weaving through the crowds with a kind of quiet determination. David followed him for several blocks, until the bustling city streets began to thin out and give way to quieter, more desolate areas. The buildings here were older, more worn, their facades cracked and chipped by time. The sidewalks had seen better days, with patches of grass growing where asphalt had once been. This wasn't the part of the city where people with means lived. And David could sense it in the air, the heavy weight of struggle that clung to the neighborhood. Finally, Elijah turned a corner and approached a small, modest house at the end of a row of similar homes. It was unremarkable at first glance, a little shabby even, with peeling paint on the door and a window with a crack in the glass. But to Elijah, it was home. David paused at the corner, hidden behind a rusted lamppost, watching as the boy reached the front door and knocked softly. The door opened slowly, and a woman's voice called out from inside. "Is that you, Elijah?" The boy nodded, his face lighting up at the sight of his mother. "Yeah, Mom, it's me." David couldn't help but watch closely as the boy entered the house. He could see the woman's face now, tired, but warm, with eyes that carried a kind of sadness David hadn't expected. The door closed softly behind them, and for a moment, all was quiet. David stood there for several minutes, contemplating what he had just witnessed. The boy's simple life, his unwavering honesty, and the evident love between mother and son, it all stirred something deep within him. He thought of his own life, his own home. How often had he come home from work, hurried through a meal, and collapsed into bed without a second thought for the people in his life? How many moments had he taken for granted, assuming that things would always be as they were? And yet, here was a boy, with so little, giving back what he had found, teaching David a lesson he had long since forgotten. As the minutes passed, David felt a growing sense of unease. He had followed Elijah to this point, and now, for the first time, he wasn't sure what to do next. His gut told him that he couldn't just leave it here, that something more needed to be done. But what? What could he offer that would mean anything to someone who had so little, but who already had so much in terms of heart? The longer he stood there, the more his resolve strengthened. He had to help this family, no, not just help them, but honor the values Elijah had shown him. His decision was clear. David turned around, walked a few steps, and went toward the market. He didn't know what exactly he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing. His life had just changed in a way he couldn't ignore. He had a chance to make a difference, to do something real, and he wasn't going to waste it. David's heart was heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. But as he walked down the street, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The world seemed a little different now, a little more open, and he was ready to face whatever came next. David couldn't shake the image of Elijah and his mother from his mind as he walked to the market. He had witnessed something rare, a boy with nothing, yet with the strength to do what was right. That honesty, that integrity, had ignited something inside him. He knew he couldn't walk away without doing something more. In the market, David filled his cart with groceries, selecting fruits, vegetables, meat, and other essentials he thought the family might need. As he went through the aisles, a sense of purpose grew stronger. Each item he added to his cart was a step towards making a difference in the lives of those who had so little. The butcher at the counter saw David's determination and asked if he was new in town. David shared the story of the boy, his honesty, and his mother's struggle. Touched by his sincerity, the butcher praised David for his generosity, though it felt to David like just a small act in comparison to what the boy had shown him. With the cart filled, David made his way back to the boy's home. This time, he knocked on the door. When Elijah opened it, his eyes widened in surprise. The boy stepped aside, allowing David to enter, and his mother looked up in shock as David explained why he was there. He told her how Elijah's actions had impacted him deeply and how he wanted to help. "Thank you," the mother said, her voice breaking with gratitude. "You've given us more than we could ever ask for." David smiled, realizing that in helping them, he had also helped himself. He had learned the true meaning of giving, of honesty, and of the power of simple acts of kindness. For more life stories and heartwarming lessons, be sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for new videos.